Welcome to CWJah Talk number 8. This show is about the divine name and the form Jah. The title of the show is Why Jah? And it's a discussion about what we consider as Christian witnesses of Jah, the least disputed form of the divine name. And really, it's the least disputed pronunciation. Form that is pronounced, I should say. So we have the form and then we pronounce the form, but when we have other forms of the divine name, like the tetragrammaton, the full, what we consider or call the full four-letter form of the divine name, Yod, He, Wah, He in Hebrew. So we're familiar with that form, but Jah is based on half, you could say, or two of those letters, two letters of the tetragrammaton, Yod, He. And so there's another form as well that's not as often used and probably lesser known for sure than both the tetragrammaton, the four-letter form, most often pronounced Jehovah in English, or Yahovah in Hebrew. And like I mentioned, Jah, the two-letter form. But there's a three-letter form of the divine name, the first three letters, Yod, He, Wah in Hebrew. And it is pronounced, according to Greek sources we have, that transliterate the Hebrew words into phonetic Greek letters, like iota, alpha, omega. We have early sources, as we're going to discuss in a moment, that show the pronunciation of that three-letter form, what you might call the trigrammaton, is Yah-O. So now there are also other representations of the divine name like Yod, He, He. If you want to see all of the different forms of the divine name, or at least most of them, probably many or most of them, look in my third edition of the Jehovah's Witnesses Defended book, where I discuss the first chapters about the divine name, and I believe it's on page 45, around there. There's a chart that lists the different forms of the divine name in Hebrew, Aramaic, and in Greek, as used by different persons or in different sources, going back to the first or second centuries, or as we'll discuss in a moment, at least in biblical sources, second millennium BCE. So, but it's not a form of the divine name we often use today. It's usually either the tetragrammaton, Jehovah. Some will use Yahweh, which we'll talk about as well in a moment. Although this show isn't really about the controversy or the differences between Yahweh and Jehovah or Jah. We are going to talk a little bit about those. And I will do another show more specific to Yahweh and the arguments people use for it, which are not many, by the way, not that I find. But today I want to really discuss the form of the divine name Jah, the two-letter form. And also in relation to it, the three-letter form, because it relates to the two-letter form in that it also shows the pronunciation of the two-letter form, right? So if you're saying Yah-O, you're also including the name Jah. And so you'll see also other reasons why early sources using Yah-O are relevant to a discussion involving the pronunciation and the least disputed pronunciation based on what I would consider the least disputed form, in that no one really disputes either the form or the pronunciation resulting from it, used from it, Yod He, or Jah in English, Yah in Hebrew, and also pretty much the same in Greek. So let me read off and discuss a list of 10 items. And I listed them here because I want to make sure that you can, I'm going to list these also in the description so that you have a summary of the main points to consider when it comes to the use of the divine name Jah and related forms like Yah-O. And then we'll also consider other information that either you may want to present in the chat or that comes up as we discuss these 10 items. So the first thing to consider or to keep in mind when you hear the name Jah, or when people ask you, why Jah? Why do you use the form of the divine name Jah? Why not Jehovah? Why not Yahweh? Why Jah? Well, the first thing you should point out is that the name Jah as a standalone name occurs 49 times, at least 49 times in the accepted Hebrew text of the Old Testament. And you can look in any concordance. Well, I shouldn't say any, but if you look in a Hebrew concordance like Kohlenberger and Swanson is a good source for looking up Hebrew words in the Bible, you'll see the 49 references. And even if you don't know Hebrew, you can still find it. Just look for the yod, hey symbols. That's not too complicated to look up. And then you'll be able to see where it lists the text where that divine name is used. So it is a divine name used almost 50 times by itself in the Bible. And so many of us have used the name. As I mentioned when I started the show, Jah and Jehovah are not unfamiliar to most people. And Jah finds its way into many songs of popular culture. And so even people in the world have heard Jah, Jehovah, but not really Yah-O or Jah-O, the three-letter form of the divine name, which also involves both Jah and, as I'll discuss later in another show, mostly the four-letter form of the divine name. So these three different forms can be best established among all the different forms of the divine name and then used to show how it was pronounced according to Jews at different times, Christians at different times, and as we'll talk about in relation to Yahweh, the Samaritans, but at a later time and in contrast to the Jewish pronunciation of the divine name. So let's go over some of these sources. We talked about the 49 times it occurs in the Hebrew text. One of the times that I should point out that in discussing Yah-O, which again also includes the form of the divine name Yah, oftentimes people will refer to sources that I will also reference in a moment, like historians like Diodorus Siculus, who wrote around 30 BCE. I'll get to him next, but people often will reference those sources and forget that Yah-O, iota, alpha, omega in Greek, or most likely transliterating the Hebrew form of the divine name Yod, He, Wah. So, and we find this form of the divine name used in places like Elephantine and by Jews in that area, and in biblical texts that we have recovered from the Dead Sea area. So, for example, in the Dead Sea Scroll 4Q, Leviticus B for the Septuagint, which dates to around the 1st century BCE, in Leviticus 3:12 and in Leviticus 4:27, it's a fragmentary text, meaning that it doesn't have the entire book of Leviticus, but the text that we do have where the divine name would be used, it uses Yah-O, iota, alpha, omega, right in and among the Hebrew Aramaic text. So when they transliterate like this, when they use a Greek transliteration means you represent the characters from one language into another language, usually your own, for purposes of pronouncing a foreign term, then they used Yah-O in the texts, or in some of the texts, in this case 4Q Leviticus B, recovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they're essentially showing us that at that time, when they read those texts, they pronounced the divine name Yah-O, just like we see represented by the around 30 BCE, right around the time when 4Q Leviticus B could have been written, maybe a little bit earlier, 50 to 100 years earlier than Diodorus Siculus, who was a famous historian, wrote a library of history. And he cites Moses. And if you look in the Loeb Classical Library series of Diodorus's works, volume 1, page 321, and again, these references are all in my chapter 1 on the divine name in my JWD book. You'll see a lot of the references that I may either give also here or allude to. But in Diodorus's work, he writes this when he's talking about Moses. He refers to Moses, and he says that Moses referred his laws, the laws that he had for the Jews, to the God who is invoked as Yahweh. Exactly the same form of the divine name used in the biblical text of Leviticus chapter 3 and chapter 4 in the Dead Sea Scroll 4Q Leviticus B. So here we have almost contemporary, if not contemporary sources, agreeing on how the divine name was pronounced in the 1st century BCE, within 100 years or so of when Jesus was born, probably more like 50 to 100 or closer to 50. If Diodorus wrote what he wrote around 30 BCE, and Jesus was born 30 or 30 some years later. So, but he became, a teacher and became known as a teacher more closer to 50 to 100 years later. So, and then you have 4Q Leviticus B, the text of Leviticus, within also about 50 years of Diodorus. So again, within the 1st century BCE, you have these two sources, the Dead Sea Scroll text of Leviticus and Diodorus, a non-Jewish Christian, non-Christian, writing that it is known that Moses referred his laws to the God who is evoked as Yahweh. So they knew at this time how the Jews invoked the God of Moses, and it was not Yahweh. Now somebody may say, well, it's not Jah either. Well, you're going to see that the Jews did or were known for using Jah, and in direct contrast to Yahweh, or a form similar to that in Greek. But here again, where I'm trying to point out that the form of the divine name that is least known, but that contains the form that is least disputed in terms of its pronunciation and form, I would say, Yah, Jah, Yod, He. But the form that includes that, Yah-O, is well established historically and within 100 years or so of the time when Jesus would have lived, taught, read from texts like 4Q Leviticus B. And of course, it's not just an isolated text in the Dead Sea Scrolls where this takes place. Diodorus writes that it is known that Moses invoked the God Yahweh, just like 4Q Leviticus B states. So this is very important to keep in mind, because we're before Jesus, but not by a long time. And there's no controversy leading up to Jesus which would indicate that any of this changed dramatically. That is the use of at least the form Yahweh. Okay, so then there's also another source. This goes forward a little bit, but it's also, as you'll see, I think relevant, because this is from Origen, and he wrote, of course, in the late 2nd to early to middle 3rd century of CE. But when he's explaining the meaning of the name Jeremiah, he says that, because the last part of Jeremiah in Greek, he includes the divine name as part of it and says that Iao, the final part of the theophoric suffix of the name Jeremiah, which the ending part, which contains the divine name, means lifting up. He explains that Jeremiah, the form of the divine name at the end of Jeremiah, means lifting up. He says Iao means lifting up. So here you have Origen defining, as we know, biblical names incorporate the divine name, one or more forms of the divine name. And so, and often that form is Yahweh. So Origen is aware of that, and he defines it so that it's clear he also understands the use of that term to represent the divine name. And he also, that's in his commentary on John, but in his book Contra Celsius 632, he talks about those who took, or who are involved in magical arts, who took the name Yahweh, or some variants say Yah, which seems to be a combination of both Yahweh and Yah, but that they took that name from the Hebrew scriptures. And he also says, which is the name used by the Hebrews. So Origen here, writing against Celsius, states that those involved in the magical arts took that form of the divine name. And he uses both Iao and Yah here. Either Yao alone or a combination, Yah, which may have been how those in the magical arts took the forms in the Bible and combined them. So, and he says they were also the names used by the Hebrews. So, as we saw, Yao was in a text of the Bible several hundred years before Origen wrote that, and even 100 or 50 to 100 years or so before Jesus taught. Now, I forgot to mention also that Diodorus' work is cited by Justin Martyr, since we're talking about Origen. So it's not just Origen who was aware of this form of the divine name or the pronunciation Yao. Justin Martyr was not only aware of it, but he cited Diodorus in regards to the divine name. Okay, so let me move to my fifth point here. We talked about the number of occurrences in the Bible for the name Jah, 49. We talked about 2 occurrences of the form Yao, which contains Yah, and which is the least known and pronounced form of the divine name, Yao. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q Leviticus B, text of Leviticus chapters 3 and 4. We talked about how Yao is used by Diodorus Siculus in the 1st century BCE when referring to the God invoked by Moses. And we referenced that Diodorus is also cited by Justin Martyr, and that Origen, in both his commentary on John and in Contra Celsius, use Yao in relation to biblical names like Jeremiah, and with regard to those who took divine names from the Hebrew scriptures to be involved in their magical arts. Okay, so then there are also what are called early onomastica, which are sources that, basically early sources that explain words and expressions. That's the simplest way to put it. And an example of that is what is referred to as P-Oxy 2745, P.OXY 2745. It's published under the title Onomasticon of Hebrew Names in the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, volume 36. That was published in 1970 on page 3 of that volume. So on page 3 of that volume, it shows Yao 8 times in a column that provides, basically definitions or etymological interpretations of names, Old Testament names that are translated into Greek. And so this text, this onomasticon, this papyrus is dated to the 3rd century CE. So it would have been potentially contemporaneous with Origen and Justin Martyr. Well, it depends about Justin Martyr, but certainly Origen, potentially, and other Christians at this time. But it was used to help explain the theophoric elements of the divine name used as part of other names that Greek-speaking persons wanted to better understand from a Hebrew Aramaic-speaking Jew or Christian's perspective, or someone more familiar with Greek who could explain these terms or the meaning of these names to those unfamiliar with them. It's also important to note that, again, this could be a Jewish or a Christian scribe who wrote this onomasticon, but in addition to Iao as the divine name, it also contracts the word for God in Greek as a nomina sacra, or sacred name, in column B, line 5 of the reference I gave earlier. So here you have a text where they use both the divine name and a nomina sacra. So it's unclear how this relates to the transition from the use of the divine name, like in texts we referred to earlier, such as the Dead Sea Scroll text, 4Q Leviticus B. It's unclear at what point the transition took place as far as full use of the nomina sacra or forms of the divine name or contracted abbreviations of the divine name rather than the divine name. But this text has both, so it's very interesting in that regard. And of course, it's dating, we date it to the early 3rd century, but it's not exact. So we'll continue to study that text in relation to others to try to construct a better timeline, but It appears to me that the change from the use of the divine name to Namana Sacra began sometime in the 3rd or 4th quarter of the 1st century CE, and then continued continued to transition as a result of various persecutions of Christians and of Jews who were still invoking the god Iao, like Diodorus had also reference in relation to Moses and what he was obviously teaching those who followed him, so that Diodorus knew in the 1st century BCE how they pronounce God's name. And then these other sources complement and reinforce that this was a well-known form of the name Yahweh, even though it's not very well known or used very often today. Like I said, we use most often the 4-letter form or the 2-letter form. But Yahweh contains the 2-letter form and is often used in relation to it, like in Origen's Contra Celsius text. In fact, there's a combination of the two, Yah-o-Yah. So maybe the magic users took both Yah and Yah-o, because you'll see, again, Yah is a standalone form of the divine name in the Hebrew text as well, 49 times at least. So they could have taken both forms and combined them, as they often did in some of these magical papyri, to try to create invocations and spells, not realizing that Jah does not sanction those things. Not often, I should say. There are accounts, of course, in the Bible where Jah will use many different people. But I would be very careful about trying to use the divine name in any other way than to give Jah praise. That would be my recommendation to everyone. Okay, so we've talked about the early onomasticon now, and the use of Yah-o and the contracted form for the name or term God. So Yah, now let's move into Yah a little bit. Yah-o contains Yah, and they're at times used together. But Origen, in his 5th column of what is called the hexapla, and some of these things I'm going to, if you want to look them up, just do a simple search, and you can see pretty quickly what these documents are, rather than me get off into different discussions about these different texts and sources. You can also read more about these in my chapter 1 of my 3rd edition of the Jehovah's Witnesses Defended book. So Origen, in his 5th column of the hexapla, which was written sometime around the middle of the 3rd century CE, and Origen, of course, was a scholar and was well aware of the biblical texts, languages, and the divine name. But in Psalms 67 or 68, depending on which version you're using, verse 5, what we would call verse 5, he uses the Greek transliteration Yah. And also Aquila, who translated a copy of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek around the middle of the 2nd century, he also uses Yah, the Greek transliteration iota, alpha, in his translations of Psalm 67, 68, verse 5, and Isaiah 12, 2. That's the same for Symmachus as well, another translator of the Old Testament into Greek. And in the 4th, really the 5th century, is where we get a very interesting reference. A writer, Theodoret, said this sometime in the 5th century. He says, the Samaritans pronounced the divine name Yahweh, iota, alpha, beta, epsilon, Yahweh, which kind of sounds like Yahweh, the closest I've seen, in terms of a phonetic transliteration. There's another one, I believe, also in Clement of Alexandria that's probably similar or maybe even closer, but those are really the only two. And they're not well-founded. But in any case, let me read the rest of this, because he goes on to say, but, so he says, the Samaritans pronounce it, the divine name he was talking about earlier, Yahweh, iota, alpha, beta, epsilon. But the Jews pronounce it Yah, iota, alpha. So the very source, or one of the very few sources that could be cited as support for Yahweh because of the phonetic transliteration of the divine name. By phonetic transliteration, I mean it's pronounceable. It's phonetic. It's not done to hide the pronunciation. It's done, in fact, to facilitate by transliterating it into pronounceable letters. So he says the Samaritans pronounce it Yahweh, but the Jews pronounce it Yah, which is consistent with what we have been reading up to this point, right? I just referenced Symmachus, Aquila, and Origen in their translations of the Jewish Hebrew scriptures as using the form of the divine name Yah in the book of Psalms and in Isaiah for Aquila and Symmachus. And then we also talked about how Origen uses Yah in relation to Yah-O in Contra Celsius, and how the forms Yah-O were used in biblical texts like 4Q Leviticus B, and referenced by writers like Diodorus as the form of the divine name used by Moses when invoking his God. So now that Diodorus is writing in the 1st century BCE. Here we jump forward to the 5th century. So we go from Diodorus, or really from 4Q Leviticus B. We'll get to the earlier biblical texts that use the divine name Yod-He in a minute. But I'm talking about the transliterated forms, the Greek transliterated forms, either iota alpha or iota alpha omega. So we have 4Q Leviticus B, 1st century BCE, 1st century BCE Diodorus. Then we can go forward to the late 2nd, early 3rd century Origen, and then also in the 3rd century to the Onomasticon papyri, or the Onomasticon, yes, in the Ochirhynchus papyri. And then we also have Origen using Yah in, as I mentioned, the book of Psalms. So then we get to Theodoret in the 5th century, and he's still maintaining that the Jews pronounce the divine name Yah. So we have really almost 600 years from the 1st century BCE, if 4Q Leviticus B isn't dated earlier than that, and it's possible. But let's accept the 1st century BCE for now. That's 600 years from 4Q Leviticus B to Theodoret, where it is represented that the Jews pronounce the divine name either Yah-O or Yah. Even Theodoret doesn't say the Jews pronounce the divine name Yahweh. He says the Samaritans pronounced it Yahweh. So we have Diodorus saying they said Yah-O. We have Jewish texts like 4Q Leviticus B, before Christianity even existed, stating Yah-O, consistent with Diodorus. Then we have other Christian writers, later Christian writers like Origen, referring to Yah-O, and then Jewish and Christian translators of the Hebrew Scriptures using Yah. So Theodoret's use of Yahweh for the Samaritans has essentially eclipsed not just the Jewish use of Yah, but almost everybody's use of the divine name, right? Because most often, if you're not reading the New World Translation or another Bible, and I'm not endorsing everything in the New World Translation, but it gets far more criticism than it deserves. And certainly when it comes to the divine name, even though there are texts in the New Testament where maybe they should not have used it because it doesn't represent a quotation or a source that we can cite, like 4Q Leviticus B, to show that the divine name was used in a text quoted by a New Testament writer. I think it's legitimate to use the divine name there. But setting that aside, again, many Bibles who will use a form of the divine name will often, it seems, use Yahweh rather than Yah. But the Samaritans are not the ones credited with these texts. They had their own version of the 5 books of Moses. But why is the Samaritan pronunciation of the divine name being used as a substitute, not just for Yah, right? Not just for the 49 times that Yah is used in the Hebrew Scriptures. Why is the divine name Yahweh or Yahweh, if at all based on Theodoret, being used to replace what Theodoret himself says the Jews used to pronounce the divine name, let alone what we have in these other texts and sources that tell us how the Jews pronounce the divine name, all the way back to at least 4Q Leviticus B. Now, again, I will argue that the form of the divine name, and hence also its least disputed pronunciation, is at least as far back to the time of Moses, because Moses used that form of the divine name. And so, and it may have been used earlier as well, but we know Moses was in the 2nd millennium BCE. So the form Yah, it's not just the 600 years that we can show textually from 4Q Leviticus B to Theodoret in terms of the pronunciation, either Yah-O, which includes Yah, and then how others like Diodorus and Theodoret and Symmachus, Aquila, Origen say the divine name was pronounced either Yah-O or Yah. So it's not just that 600 years. We can show that's a continuation of what the earlier use of the divine name was, which also includes, apparently, the full 4-letter form. But we'll talk about that, the full 4-letter form, the tetragrammaton, in another show. Because the divine name it's not complicated, but there are parts of the discussion when you get into the historical development and use of the divine name that are not easy, right? Because it involves language, it involves pronunciations from one language to another, and then you have to kind of create a timeline to show the consistency and usage. And as I mentioned, I do have a chart in my chapter 1 of JWD3 and earlier versions that tries to give a historical view of these different forms of the divine name in Hebrew, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, and also discusses further these sources that we talked about today and others that involve both the 2-letter form Yah, the 3-letter form Yah-O, and the 4-letter form, which we could say is something along the lines of Yahovah or Yahoyah, like in Origen contra Celsius, one of the 2 forms combined together, iota alpha omicron iota alpha, or it might be iota alpha omega there. I'm looking at a transliteration without the critical symbols. So in either case, it looks like Yah-O-Yah, and in contra Celsius 632, which he says was taken from the Hebrew scriptures. So we know that form isn't actually in there as a single term, not that we know of, but we know the 2 forms were Yah-O, like 4Q Leviticus B, and Yah, in texts like Psalm 135. So we have texts where the use of both Yah and other forms of the divine name occur, like I mentioned with Psalm 135. It says this, it says, praise Jah, which is hallelu, that means praise you, and then the divine name Jah, Yod He in Hebrew. So Psalm 135, hallelujah, praise Jah, for Jehovah, I'm reading from the New World Translation, is good. Make melody to his name, for it is pleasant. So here in Psalm 135, you have a use of both the full 4-letter form, Yod, He, Wah, He, often in English pronounced Jehovah, and you have the 2-letter form, Yod, He, or in Greek, iota, alpha, like Theodoret said the Jews pronounce it, used in the same text. And then, as I mentioned, you have Yah-O used in the Dead Sea Scroll text of Leviticus chapter 3:12 and 4:27. So Yah, Yah-O, and Yahovah are all used in the Bible or in biblical texts. Yahweh, like Theodoret uses to transliterate how the Samaritans pronounce the divine name in contrast to the Jews, Yahweh is not. Yahweh is not used in the Bible as a form of the divine name. So I'm going to do a separate show on Yahweh, and we'll talk about how some try to defend its pronunciation primarily on verbal association grounds, And a couple early references, not so early as you notice with Theodoret, but a couple that have these transliterations. But again, notice that Theodoret is making a contrast between the Samaritans and the Jews. And what he says is consistent with how the Jewish sources, or references to Jewish sources like Diodorus, say that Jah's name was pronounced, whereas Yahweh is not. And that's the point of what Theodoret is saying. So unless people want to try to promote the Samaritan pronunciation of the divine name, which is inconsistent, as I mentioned, with the other forms of the divine name, and as I will discuss later in more detail, and as I certainly do discuss in more detail in my writings, not only the JWD 3 chapter 1, but in other references that I give in the notes and on the Watching the Ministry blog. Okay, so I mentioned that Psalm 135:3 uses both Yah and the four-letter form of the divine name, which we use Jehovah in English, anglicized form. So it is a biblical term, but it's not just used in these 49. Psalm 135 is one instance where of the 49 or so references in the Old Testament. It's used in the New Testament as well. In Revelation chapter 19, it uses the divine name 4 times in verse 1, verse 3, verse 4, and verse 6. It uses the exact same expression that we just read from Psalm 139, verse 5. 135, verse 3. Hallelujah. Now, in Greek, in the text of Revelation, it uses a transliteration. It represents in Greek characters how to pronounce the Hebrew term or expression that was either used or spoken. And the transliteration is Alleluia. Praise you, Jah. Praise Jah. And so people often forget that because Revelation 19, even though many Bibles do use Jah there, often they will also either substitute it, praise the Lord, or use an entire expression like hallelujah. We're all very familiar with hallelujah. And that is simply an English transliteration of the Hebrew hallelujah, which is translated in Greek in Revelation as Alleluia. So they're all the same, but we just have combined them in a way that sort of, not entirely, but somewhat hides the divine name as a standalone term. And so that's why you don't often hear it. You might hear it in certain songs, as I mentioned, but it's not often used as a substitute for the full 4-letter form of the divine name. But it is used there. It's transliterated. It is known. It was a known term, not only from the Hebrew scriptures, the use of it there in texts like Psalm 135:3, but as we discussed earlier, we have texts where Jews and others who translated the Hebrew scriptures, like Aquila, Symmachus, Origen, and early sources that explain terms from the Hebrew Bible, like Onomastica, use forms of the divine name that are consistent with Yah, not with Yahweh, like we saw with Theodoret when he was contrasting the Samaritans and the Jews' pronunciation. So, why Jah? Well, it's really simple. We believe that's the form of God's name that should be used because it's the least controversial and the least disputed, right? Very few people really take issue when you say Jah. They might, but you can easily show, as I just did, that it's based on the Hebrew use of the very same name, Jah or Yah, and that texts like Psalm 135 are used in word-for-word form when it comes to praising Jah in texts like Revelation 19. And it is also referenced by other sources, even by one of the very sources that are often cited as support for Yahweh, Theodoret. That's why we use Jah. It's a biblical term for God's name that doesn't come with the controversy that is either associated with Yahweh because it's the least known and hence least used form of the divine name, it would require explanation. If you started going around just invoking Yah-oh, like the Jews did according to Diodorus and according to early biblical texts like 4Q Leviticus B, if you did that today, it wouldn't be incorrect. You would just have to explain what you mean. And in English today, doing so, even though this show, I think we've done a fairly good job trying to simplify some of the evidence, not all, but I'll put links in the description for more information. I've written a lot about this, as have others, but I'll put as much information in the description as I can related to Jah and some of the divine name controversies. But so when it comes to using the term, we're trying to present the great message, right? This is not about where can we debate somebody. Where can I go find somebody and argue with them over my God's name? That's not the idea. Now, if we find somebody misrepresenting the form of the divine name and knowingly using something when they could easily, like we just did, this is not secret information, it's very much available for anyone who takes a little time to look. Then, of course, we want to step in and either point that person to sources like this video or some of the references I gave and say, listen, you know, it looks like you have a desire to please God, but we often find that people use the form of the divine name Yahweh, but they don't realize that's really known as the Samaritan pronunciation, in contrast to the Jews' pronunciation. And you can show them texts like Theodoret. I'll give the reference in the description below. And so there are easy ways to go about talking to people. Now, if they argue with you and they want to talk about why they use Yahweh, that's fine. You can do it according to what you think is appropriate and reasonable. And there is more for us to discuss when it comes to using Yahweh. But this show is not about Yahweh. This show is about Jah. The easiest form of the divine name to show is used in the Bible. Even though it's not the most often used, it's undisputed that it's used in both the Hebrew and the New Testament, you see. That's why I say the least disputed form, because it's not disputed when it comes to issues involving the divine name in the New Testament. But the four-letter form is, because that's what's used by Bibles like the New World Translation. So people will take issue with it, and then that becomes a subject of controversy. CWJah, it doesn't represent the Tetragrammaton. It's just another form of the divine name used in the Bible. You might want to rewatch the earlier part of the video. As I mentioned, the form of the divine name Jah is used 49 times at least on its own in the Bible, Hebrew scriptures. And then another 4 times at a minimum, not part of other names, theophoric elements of other names, in Revelation chapter 19. So it's its own name. That's why Psalm 135:3 uses both, just like, well, Revelation 19 doesn't use both because it's just using the expression in praise of Jah after the things he's done. But in Psalms, of course, they talk often about the divine name and use it in multiple types of expressions of praise, one of which is using both Yah and Yahuwah, so that one doesn't represent the other, one is a part of the other, or a standalone name, as persons like even Moses state, and as all the other sources that I quoted earlier state, even the one who references a pronunciation used by the Samaritans. So that's what I would say in answer to that. But those are the reasons, some of the primary reasons why we use Jah. We consider it the least disputed form because it's in both the Hebrew scriptures, Hebrew Old Testament scriptures, and in the New Testament, Revelation chapter 19. Even though we can argue that the texts in the New Testament that quote the Hebrew scriptures, where they contain the full 4-letter form of the divine name, we can show that those texts like 4Q Leviticus B contained a pronounceable form of the divine name, either the full 4-letter form written in Hebrew Aramaic characters or forms like Yah-oh. So there's no reason to believe the writers of the New Testament in the first century wouldn't have quoted those texts like 4Q Leviticus B. There is no biblical text, Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek, that we can date to before, or, it's hard to date right at the time when someone's writing, like Paul or John, but there's no biblical text that can be dated to before hence existing up to the point when they would be writing and quoting it, that doesn't contain a form of the divine name, that contains things like nomina sacra. And so they quoted that. All of the evidence we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Hebrew Aramaic forms of the divine name in the Old Testament, and in the text where a Greek form of the divine name is used, right in and among the Hebrew Aramaic text, like 4Q Leviticus B. I'm not sure, well, I'd have to take another look at that to see if that's entirely in Greek or not. But in any case, it uses the form Yahoo there, and I believe there are other texts. I think it uses Aramaic terms, characters actually, for the divine name when it's used in the Greek text. So you can see all the different sources where forms of the divine name in 1st century CE or earlier biblical texts that would have been quoted by the Christian writers use a form of the divine name. Either Yahoo as in 4Q Leviticus B, or in other texts that used Hebrew Aramaic characters. So it's one form of the divine name or other that, as we read earlier, was known even by 1st century BC individuals like Diodorus as being pronounced Yahoo. So we have all of this information which is consistent with those three pronunciations, Yah, Yahoo, and Yahuwah. And I talk more about this in my chapter 1 of JWD3 to show phonetically how they relate to each other more, and in relation to other forms, like I provide on the chart around, I think, page 45 of JWD3. So I'm just giving a summary of some of the what I consider best, easiest to use information, really. There's other good information. But I wanted to try and give people references and a discussion of those references that would hopefully simplify some of the issues. Because when it comes to Jah, and I don't want to get too much off onto Yahoo and Yahweh in the four-letter form, we will in the future, and maybe even after the show a little bit. But I want to wrap this up here on the divine name specifically as it relates to Jah before we go further and maybe talk a little bit more about the Tetragrammaton and other divine name issues. We can do that a little. But just in terms of the show, I like to keep these about an hour and concentrate on the topic so that we can use these videos and say, okay, you want to know why we use Jah? Look at this video. Here's a discussion of some of the evidence and information about not just the form of the divine name Jah, which is used by itself in the Hebrew Bible and used by itself in the New Testament at least 4 times as part of a well-known expression that meant to praise Jah. And then you can also from that point discuss other texts, because most often people will want to know, okay, well, why doesn't the New Testament use the divine name explicitly in the copies that we have? None of which, well, as I've discussed in my day text, we have good textual evidence for all the New Testament letters and documents within 50 to 100 years of their original writing. But a lot can happen in 50 to 100 years, especially when you're going through decades where you're being persecuted all over the place and going through massive persecutions at different periods of time, like under Nero or Domitian and others. So I wanted to give this show and make sure at least that we had a discussion about Jah and why we use it more so than, say, Jehovah or Yahoo, Jaho. And that is because it's the least disputed and the easiest to pronounce. Very few people are going to dispute with you how to pronounce iota alpha or yod hey. And so when I consider how we're supposed to be trying to reach people with the great message, the last thing that I want is to get sidetracked on a dispute over something that is actually fairly easy to show historically how people pronounce the item under dispute, the divine name. In other words, it's not as controversial or difficult as many people believe or would have you think, but it has become difficult because of the way people act and think, or their use of sources like Theodoret and a couple others to try to suggest that Yahweh is the right way to say the divine name, if you should say it at all. So then you complicate the subject again, now not just about whether it's used in the biblical texts, like New Testament texts, But then now, how should we pronounce it? So the full four-letter form often gets us into these side discussions about pronunciation, Yahweh, was it quoted by the New Testament writers? My goal, and the whole reason why we're Christian witnesses of Jah, is because we can avoid all of that by simply showing texts like Psalm 135:3 that use both the two-letter and four-letter form of the divine name, and over 40 different texts that use the standalone form of the divine name Jah in the Hebrew scriptures, combined with texts like Revelation 19 to show that we have support in both the Hebrew and Greek scriptures. And there's no dispute really over how to pronounce it. Everyone agrees that iota alpha or yod hey is Yah, Yah, Jah in English. And that's the language that I speak. So you may say it a little differently in yours, but Jah's the one who authored languages, right? He separated language at the Tower of Babel. We have a video on that. So he's the one who has allowed the different developments of language and our phonetic abilities to use his name, which is not very far off from the sources we considered today that show that most often it was Yah-O or Yah. And as I will show in future shows, also Yahweh.